At 18, she was the most beautiful bride in Europe. Her wedding to the young king of Greece was hailed as a living fairy tale. But the fairy tale ended in just 3 years. When tanks surrounded her palace in the dead of night, she was a young mother holding her breath as democracy collapsed. Months later, pregnant with her third child, she was forced to flee into a winter storm on a plane running dangerously low on fuel, leaving her crown, her home, and her life behind. In a single night, she went from being the youngest queen in the world to a stateless refugee. But the true tragedy of Anne-Marie was not the loss of her throne. It was that she became the target of a nation's hatred meant for another woman, her domineering mother-in-law, Queen Frederica. This is the story of the Rose of Denmark, a gentle soul crushed by the ruthless machinery of Greek politics. Anne-Marie Dagmar Ingrid was born on August 30th, 1946 in Copenhagen. To understand her psychological makeup and her eventual psychological makeup in Greece, you must understand the environment that shaped her. Denmark is not Greece. The Danish monarchy in the mid-20th century was the antithesis of the Greek throne. It was secure, it was constitutional, it was boring. King Frederick IX, Anne-Marie's father, was a tattooed sailor who loved classical music and conducting orchestras. Her mother, Queen Ingrid, was a Swedish princess who instilled in her daughters a sense of duty, modesty, and domestic discipline. This was the bicycle monarchy. The royal family did not hide behind iron gates and secret police. They shopped in local stores. They walked the streets without bodyguards. Anne-Marie grew up in a world where the biggest scandal might be a bad review of a royal concert. She was the youngest of 3 sisters, Margrethe, the future queen, Benedicta, and Anne-Marie. She was the baby of the family, the gentle one. While Margrethe was being groomed for the throne, intellectual, artistic, and imposing, Anne-Marie was allowed to be simply Anne-Marie. She was educated at Zahles School in Copenhagen and later at a Swiss finishing school. Her education prepared her to be a perfect aristocratic wife. She learned languages, history, and child care. She learned how to host a dinner party and how to smile through boredom. But she did not learn how to survive a coup d'etat. She did not learn how to negotiate with military juntas. She did not learn that a smile could be interpreted as weakness or that silence could be interpreted as complicity. This is the first layer of the tragedy. Anne-Marie was raised in a sanctuary. She had no natural immunity to the toxicity of politics. She believed that if you were good and kind and dutiful, the people would love you. She had no concept of a world where a queen could be hated simply for existing. When she looked at a map of Europe, she saw a family tree. She didn't see the fault lines of the Cold War. She didn't see the CIA, the KGB, or the shadow of the Civil War that still hung over the Balkans. She was a lamb being raised in a green pasture, unaware that she was being fattened for a wedding feast in a den of wolves. The official story, the fairy tale narrative sold by the press, is that Crown Prince Constantine of Greece fell in love with Anne-Marie when she was just 13 years old. In 1959, the Greek royal family visited Copenhagen. Constantine was 19. He was the golden boy of Europe. He was an athlete, a competitive sailor, a karate black belt, and heartbreakingly handsome. He carried himself with the easy confidence of a young god. Anne-Marie was a child. She was still in braces. But according to the legend, Constantine told his parents right then and there, "She is the one. I will wait for her." There is a romantic gloss to this, but we must look at it with the cold eye of a detective. This was not just a romance, it was a dynastic alignment. Queen Frederica of Greece, the nightmare mother-in-law, was ecstatic. Why? Because Anne-Marie was perfect on paper. She was Lutheran, easily converted to Orthodoxy. She was royal, no commoner blood. And most importantly to Frederica, she was young. Frederica saw in Anne-Marie a blank slate, a young, malleable girl who could be molded into the perfect Greek queen, or rather, the perfect subordinate Greek queen. Frederica did not want a rival. She wanted a student. She wanted a daughter-in-law who wouldn't ask difficult questions about the budget or the secret police. The courtship took place in the shadows. Over the next few years, they met at royal weddings and funerals, the social calendar of the European elite. Constantine would write her letters. He would send her records. In 1962, at the wedding of Sofia of Greece to Juan Carlos of Spain, the relationship became an open secret. Anne-Marie was 15. She was a bridesmaid, looking ethereal in a simple dress. Constantine couldn't take his eyes off her. The photographers caught every glance, every smile. The narrative was set, the Romeo and Juliet of royalty. But unlike Romeo and Juliet, their families were not enemies. They were conspiring to bring them together. King Frederick of Denmark was hesitant. He thought Anne-Marie was too young to deal with the volatile politics of Greece, but he couldn't deny the match. It was prestigious. It was glamorous. In January 1963, the engagement was announced. Anne-Marie was 16. She was 16 years old, an age unprepared for power, scrutiny, or survival. Most girls are worrying about high school exams. Anne-Marie was being prepared to rule a country that had seen 4 coups, a dictatorship, and a brutal civil war in the last 30 years. She was being asked to step into a role that had destroyed hardened statesmen. The photos from the engagement show a radiant Anne-Marie showing off her sapphire ring. She looks happy. She looks in love. But if you look closely at her eyes, there is a hint of bewilderment. She is holding onto Constantine's arm as if he is the only solid thing in a spinning world. She didn't know it yet, but he was not solid ground. He was standing on a trapdoor. The fairy tale hit its first snag before the wedding even happened. In March 1964, King Paul of Greece died of stomach cancer. Overnight, the 23-year-old playboy prince became King Constantine II, and the 17-year-old schoolgirl Anne-Marie became the fiancée of a ruling monarch. The stakes changed instantly. This was no longer a wedding of a crown prince, it was the wedding of the king. The pressure multiplied. Anne-Marie was not just marrying into a family, she was marrying into the state. In Athens, the atmosphere was schizophrenic. The nation was mourning King Paul, but it was also vibrating with the tension of the diarchy. Queen Frederica refused to step back. She clung to power, claiming that Constantine was too young to rule alone. Anne-Marie watched this from Copenhagen. She must have felt the chill wind blowing from the south. Her future mother-in-law was already asserting dominance, organizing the funeral, organizing the government, organizing the king. Where did Anne-Marie fit in? The wedding date was set for September 18, 1964. It was decided that the show must go on. The monarchy needed a boost. They needed a spectacle to distract the people from the rising inflation and the political unrest. They needed a fairy tale to whitewash the cracks in the regime. Anne-Marie was the prop they needed. She arrived in Athens just weeks before the wedding. She converted to Greek Orthodoxy in a solemn ceremony. She renounced her rights to the Danish throne. She stripped herself of her past to become Greek. But Greece is a jealous lover. It demands total submission. The summer of 1964 was hot, oppressively hot. The political heat was rising too. The Center Union Party, led by George Papandreou, had won the elections. The liberals were demanding reform. The army was restless. And in the middle of this cauldron, the palace was planning the most expensive, lavish wedding in modern history. The wedding of King Constantine and Queen Anne-Marie was the last great pageant of the old Europe. It was the swan song of the monarchy, though nobody knew it at the time. 5 kings, 6 queens, and dozens of princes and princesses attended. The guest list was the Almanac de Gotha come to life. The security was massive. Anne-Marie wore a dress by the Danish designer Jürgen Bender. It was simple, elegant, and timeless. She wore the Khedive of Egypt tiara. She looked like an angel. When she walked down the aisle, a collective sigh went up from the congregation. She was innocence personified. But look at the details that the fairy tale cameras missed. The heat inside the cathedral was suffocating. Several guards fainted. The smell of incense mixed with sweat and melting wax. The crowds outside were so large and so enthusiastic that they broke police lines. It was a mob, a happy mob for now, but a mob nonetheless. And then there was the omen. As the ceremony ended and the gun salutes fired over Mount Lycabettus, a storm began to brew. The sky turned a bruised purple. It was a violent, sudden Mediterranean storm. In Greek folklore, rain on a wedding day is lucky. It brings fertility. But this wasn't just rain. It was a deluge. There is a moment captured in newsreels where the couple is waving from the balcony of the royal palace. They look triumphant. They are young, beautiful, and seemingly invincible. But behind them, in the shadows of the French doors, stands Queen Frederica. She is not waving. She is watching. She is watching the crowd, assessing the energy, calculating. Anne-Marie was waving to her subjects, believing they were cheering for her. Frederica knew better. She knew the crowd was fickle. She knew that the same people throwing roses today could be throwing stones tomorrow. The tragedy of this day lies in the disconnect between the image and the reality. The world saw a fairy tale. The politicians saw a distraction. The army saw a weak king distracted by a pretty wife. And Anne-Marie saw a happy ending. She didn't know that she had just walked into a golden cage. The door had locked behind her, and the key was in her mother-in-law's pocket. The honeymoon was brief. They went to a Greek island. But even there, the state intruded. Couriers arrived with papers for the king to sign. The telephone rang constantly. When they returned to Athens, the reality of Anne-Marie's new life set in. She moved into the Tatoi Palace, not as the mistress of the house, but as a guest in her own home. Here, the nightmare began to grind her down. Tatoi Palace was not her home. It was Queen Frederica's domain. The servants were loyal to Frederica. The menus were chosen by Frederica. The decor was Frederica's taste. Anne-Marie, just 18 years old, tried to assert herself in small ways. She wanted to change the flowers. She wanted to rearrange the furniture in her private sitting room. She was met with polite but firm resistance from the staff. Her Majesty, the Queen Mother, prefers it this way, was the constant refrain. Imagine the psychological isolation. She was in a foreign country. She spoke halting Greek. Her husband was consumed by meetings with generals and ministers, trying to hold his crumbling government together. And her only female companion was a mother-in-law who viewed her as an incompetent child. The fairy tale was rapidly revealing its structural flaws. Anne-Marie was lonely. She wrote letters home to Denmark, cheerful letters that hid the growing emptiness she felt. She was the queen of Greece, but she wasn't even the queen of her own kitchen. And outside the palace gates, the old man of democracy, George Papandreou, was preparing to challenge the king's authority. The political storm was gathering speed, and it was heading straight for the young couple who thought love could conquer all. By the winter of 1964, the glitter of the wedding had faded, and the brutal reality of Anne-Marie's new life had set in. She was the Queen of the Hellenes, a title that suggests absolute authority over the social and domestic sphere of the monarchy. But in practice, she was a lodger in her mother-in-law's house. This is where the fairy tale narrative began to crack under the weight of the nightmare mother-in-law. Queen Frederica did not move out. She did not retire to a country estate. She remained at Tatoy, the royal residence, and she retained total control over the household staff. The servants, who had served Frederica for decades, remained loyal to her. When Anne-Marie gave an order, perhaps a request for a different type of flower arrangement or a change in the dinner schedule, the staff would often hesitate, glancing nervously at the Queen Mother for approval. Imagine the psychological impact on an 18-year-old girl. Anne-Marie had left her family, her country, and her language to be with the man she loved. She expected to build a home. Instead, she found herself in a museum curated by another woman. Frederica's dominance was not just domestic, it was psychological. She criticized Anne-Marie's fashion choices, calling them too simple or too Danish. She corrected her Greek in front of guests. She treated the reigning queen like a well-meaning but incompetent intern. The fatal weakness of Anne-Marie in this period was her silence. Raised in the polite, conflict-averse court of Denmark, she did not know how to fight a street brawl with a Hanoverian autocrat. She absorbed the slights, she smiled, she retreated. Constantine, caught between his formidable mother and his young wife, failed to draw a line. He was trying to run a country that was rapidly spiraling into chaos, and he didn't have the emotional bandwidth to manage the domestic Cold War. As a result, Anne-Marie was left isolated. She spent her days learning Greek, writing letters to Copenhagen, and waiting for her husband to come home from meetings where his mother was often present, whispering in his ear. The Greek people began to notice. They saw newsreels where Frederica stood in the center, pushing Anne-Marie to the periphery. They saw the diarchy, the two-headed rule of Constantine and Frederica, and they began to pity the young queen. But pity is a dangerous emotion for a monarch. It is only one step away from irrelevance. In the summer of 1965, Anne-Marie was heavily pregnant with her first child. The couple had retreated to the island of Corfu, to the Mon Repos Palace, hoping for some peace away from the stifling atmosphere of Athens. On July 10, 1965, she gave birth to Princess Alexia. It should have been a moment of national celebration, a new heir, a symbol of continuity. The cannons fired a 21-gun salute. The church bells rang across the Aegean. For a brief shining moment, the fairy tale flickered back to life. The image of the beautiful young mother and her baby was splashed across every newspaper. But history has a cruel sense of timing. While Anne-Marie was recovering from childbirth in Corfu, Athens was exploding. The old man of democracy, Prime Minister George Papandreou, was locked in a death struggle with King Constantine over control of the Ministry of Defense. Papandreou wanted to purge the army of disloyal right-wing officers. Constantine, guided by Frederica, refused to let a politician touch his army. 5 days after Alexia was born, on July 15, 1965, Constantine made the decision that would destroy his throne. He forced the resignation of Papandreou. He effectively fired the popularly elected prime minister. This was the apostasia, the defection. It was a royal coup in all but name. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The July events began. For 70 days, Athens burned. Hundreds of thousands of people flooded the streets. They weren't cheering for the baby princess. They were screaming for the king's head. Imagine Anne-Marie's position. She is 19 years old. She has a 5-day-old baby in her arms. She is hormonally exhausted, physically recovering, and emotionally vulnerable. And from across the water, the news arrives that her husband is now the most hated man in Greece. The chants from the streets of Athens reached her, even in the seclusion of Mont Repos. The mob wasn't just attacking the king's politics, they were attacking his family. Take your mother and go. Frederica, leave. Anne-Marie realized then that she hadn't just married a man, she had married a target. The hatred for her mother-in-law was so visceral, so deep, that it threatened to consume the entire dynasty. She looked at her newborn daughter and must have wondered, what kind of world have I brought you into? This was the true horror of her situation. The joy of motherhood was instantly contaminated by the poison of politics. There was no maternity leave for a queen under siege. She had to smile for the cameras, present the baby to the bishops, and pretend that the kingdom wasn't falling apart, all while knowing that the mob was gathering at the gates. After the apostasia, the Greek monarchy entered a zombie phase. Governments rose and fell every few weeks. Parliament was a circus of bribery and defection. The king tried to appoint puppet prime ministers, but none could hold power. Anne-Marie tried to do what she was trained to do, be the charitable, kind face of the regime. She visited hospitals. She handed out aid to the poor. She launched the Her Majesty's Fund for rural development. In Denmark, this would have worked. In Denmark, a queen visiting a hospital is seen as a sign of care. In Greece, in 1966, it was seen as propaganda. The leftist press began to turn on her. They didn't attack her character directly. She was too innocent for that. But they attacked her irrelevance. They painted her as a foreigner, a naive girl playing with dolls while the country starved. They mocked her Danish accent. They scrutinized her spending. This is a crucial element of the fairy tale turned nightmare. The very qualities that made her attractive in 1964, her youth, her foreign glamour, her distance from politics, were now liabilities. She was seen as out of touch, and inside the palace the isolation deepened. Constantine was consumed by the crisis. He was holding secret meetings with generals, trying to keep the army loyal. He was stressed, irritable, and paranoid. The golden boy was aging rapidly. Anne-Marie became the silent witness to the conspiracy. She saw the generals coming and going late at night. She heard the hushed conversations about suppressing the communists. She knew that something dark was brewing, but she was powerless to stop it. She was pregnant again. In 1966, she announced she was expecting her second child. This should have been another happy occasion, but in the context of the looming dictatorship, a royal pregnancy felt like a complication. It raised the stakes. If the king fell now, he wouldn't just be losing a crown, he would be endangering a growing family. This was the fatal miscalculation of the couple. They thought they could ride the tiger. They thought that by using the army and the police to suppress the Center Union Party, they could restore order. They didn't realize that the tiger was hungry, and it didn't care about the pedigree of its riders. Anne-Marie's role was to be the beautiful distraction. She was the human shield of the monarchy. Whenever the political heat got too high, the palace would release a photo of the beautiful young queen and her baby. It was a cynical use of her image, weaponizing her innocence to cover up the stench of corruption. On May the 20th, 1967, Anne-Marie gave birth to her second child, Crown Prince Pavlos. The timing of this birth matters. The date is crucial. Pavlos was born after the coup, But the months leading up to his birth were the final descent into hell. Throughout late 1966 and early 1967, the atmosphere in Athens was electric with tension. Everyone knew something was going to happen. The elections were scheduled for May 1967. All polls showed that George Papandreou and the Center Union would win a landslide victory. For Frederica and Constantine, this was unacceptable. They believed a Papandreou victory would mean the end of the monarchy. Anne-Marie watched as her husband planned a general's coup. It was an open secret in the palace. The king intended to suspend the Constitution to prevent the elections. He was plotting against his own people. Imagine the stress on a pregnant woman. Every night she went to bed wondering if the mob would storm the gates. Every morning she woke up checking if the flag was still flying. She was no longer the fairy tale bride. She was the wife of a conspirator. And then the irony struck. While the king was planning his coup, a group of lower-ranking officers, the colonels, were planning their own. They decided they didn't need the king. They would save the country for him, whether he liked it or not. Beneath the public smiles, Anne-Marie was suffering from a profound loneliness. She couldn't talk to her family in Denmark about the coup. It was too dangerous, too secret. She couldn't talk to the Greek politicians. They were the enemy. She was trapped in a silo of silence, surrounded by men in uniforms who viewed her as a breeding vessel for the dynasty. She threw herself into motherhood. The nursery became her bunker. It was the only room in the Tatoi Palace where she felt in control, the only place where the toxic politics of Greece couldn't reach her. But walls cannot stop tanks. As the spring of 1967 approached, the Rose of Denmark was about to face the harshest winter of her life. The fairy tale was over. The thriller was about to begin. The girl who had walked down the aisle in a storm of flower petals was about to run for her life under the threat of treason and arrest. On the night of April 21st, 1967, the fairy tale didn't just end, it was crushed under the treads of a tank. Anne-Marie was 20 years old. She was 8 months pregnant with her second child. At 2 a.m., the phone lines to the palace went dead. The electricity was cut. The radio began to play military marches, always the soundtrack of a coup in Greece. When King Constantine tried to call his generals, he found only silence. The men he thought commanded the army had been arrested in their pajamas. The colonels, a group of mid-ranking ultra-nationalist officers, led by George Papadopoulos, had seized control of the country. Imagine the terror of that moment. Anne-Marie, heavy with child, clutching her 21-month-old daughter, Alexia, watching as soldiers surrounded her home. These were the same soldiers who were sworn to protect her. Now their guns were pointed at her nursery. This was the nightmare in its most brutal form. The palace, which had been her golden cage, was now a literal prison. The king was given an ultimatum: swear in the junta government, or the army would storm the palace. Anne-Marie watched her husband wrestle with this impossible choice. If he resisted, there would be a bloodbath. If he agreed, he would become a puppet of a fascist dictatorship. Frederica, ever the survivor, urged him to sign. Better a live king than a dead hero, she argued. So later that morning, Constantine stood in the palace ballroom, looking like a man at his own funeral, and swore in the colonels. Anne-Marie stood beside him. In the official photos from that day, she looked shell-shocked. She is wearing a simple maternity dress, her face pale and drawn. She forced a smile, but her eyes were dead. By legitimizing the coup, the royal couple committed moral suicide. They became the face of the dictatorship. To the outside world and to the Greek Democrats, the fairy tale queen was now the junta queen. The girl who had symbolized hope was now the symbol of oppression. 1 month after the coup on May 20th, 1967, Anne-Marie gave birth to her son, Crown Prince Pavlos. Under normal circumstances, the birth of a male heir is the highest achievement for a queen consort. It secures the dynasty. It is a moment of national joy. But in 1967, the birth felt like a cruel joke. The streets of Athens were quiet, too quiet. The press was censored. Thousands of Greeks, politicians, artists, students were being arrested and tortured in military police cells. Anne-Marie had to present her son to the world with the junta leaders standing behind her, grinning like proud uncles. It was a grotesque tableau. The innocence of the baby was used to humanize the brutality of the regime. Looking closely at her life during this period, we see a woman living in a state of high-functioning terror. She was essentially under house arrest. Her phone calls were monitored. Her mail was opened. The servants were replaced by spies, loyal to the colonels. She couldn't speak freely, even in her own bedroom. She and Constantine developed a code language to communicate. When they wanted to talk about politics, they would walk in the gardens, away from the hidden microphones, whispering under the noise of a fountain. This is the psychological toll of the nightmare. Anne-Marie was a new mother, trying to bond with her infant son while knowing that every diaper change, every feeding, every lullaby was happening under the gaze of a hostile state. She was raising a future king for a kingdom that had already ceased to exist. She threw herself into charity work, trying to maintain some connection with the people, but it was hollow. When she visited orphanages, the children were lined up by soldiers. When she visited hospitals, the doctors were terrified to speak to her. She was a ghost walking through a graveyard of democracy. And yet, she stayed. She stayed because she believed in her husband. She believed that he was biding his time, that he was waiting for the right moment to strike back. She didn't know that the right moment would never come. By the autumn of 1967, the situation was untenable. The junta was consolidating power. They were purging the army of royalist officers. They were preparing a new constitution that would reduce the king to a figurehead. Constantine decided to act. He began to plan a counter-coup. The plan was simple, too simple. The royal family would fly to Kavala, a city in northern Greece where the army was still loyal. The king would declare a new government, rally the troops, and march on Athens to liberate the country. Anne-Marie was a central part of this conspiracy. She was not just a passive observer. She helped organize the logistics. She packed the bags. She prepared the children. But being an amateur is a fatal weakness. They were playing a deadly game against professional soldiers. The colonels had spies everywhere. They knew the king was plotting something. They let him think he was clever, waiting for him to make a mistake. The atmosphere in the palace became suffocating. Anne-Marie was now pregnant with her third child, a detail that adds a layer of immense physical vulnerability to the story. She was organizing a military coup while dealing with morning sickness and caring for a toddler and a baby. She packed small suitcases, pretending they were going on a Christmas holiday. She hid jewels in the lining of coats. She prepared powdered milk for the baby. It was a surreal existence. On the surface, she was hosting tea parties for diplomats. Underneath, she was a revolutionary. She was living a double life, terrified that one slip of the tongue would send them all to a firing squad. On December 12, 1967, the king gave the signal. The time has come. Anne-Marie looked at her husband. She looked at her sleeping children. She knew that by tomorrow night, they would either be heroes or prisoners. There was no middle ground. The counter-coup began on the morning of December 13th. The royal family flew to Kavala. For a few hours, it seemed like it might work. The local commanders pledged loyalty. The Navy and Air Force declared for the king. Anne-Marie sat in a command post in Kavala, listening to the radio. She heard her husband broadcast a message to the Greek people, "I am with you. Resist the dictators." But the message never reached Athens. The junta controlled the radio transmitters. They simply jammed the signal. In Athens, the colonels moved with ruthless efficiency. They arrested the few remaining loyal generals. They cut the phone lines to the north. They announced on state radio that the king was trying to start a civil war, claiming he was unstable and misled by foreign agents. By late afternoon, the coup was collapsing. The army units in the north were confused and hesitant. They didn't want to fight their brother officers. The march on Athens never happened. Anne-Marie watched the hope drain from her husband's face. She saw the generals in Kavala looking at their watches, looking at the door, calculating their own survival. By evening, loyalist tanks were surrounded. The fuel for the planes was being blocked. The king realized the truth. It was over. He had two choices: stay and fight a bloody civil war he would likely lose, or flee. He chose to flee. This is the moment the fairy tale truly died. The king's move had failed not because he lacked courage, but because he lacked ruthlessness. He wasn't a killer. The colonels were. Anne-Marie packed the children back into the car. They drove to the airfield in the driving rain. It was a chaotic, desperate scene. There was no protocol, no order, just a family running for their lives. As they boarded the small plane, the pilot gave them terrifying news. "Your Majesty, we may not have enough fuel to reach Rome, and the weather over the mountains is terrible." Anne-Marie looked at her children. Alexia was crying. Pavlos was asleep. She was carrying her unborn third child. She looked at the dark runway slick with rain, and then back at the lights of Kavala, the last lights of Greece she would see for decades. She stepped onto the plane. The door closed, and with it, the door on her life as a queen closed forever. The flight was a descent into the abyss. It was 2 a.m. on December 14th, 1967. The king, the queen mother, two toddlers, and Princess Irene were packed into a plane designed for short executive hops, not a desperate escape across the Adriatic Sea in a winter storm. Inside, to conserve power, the cabin lights were off. Anne-Marie sat in the dark. She was 21 years old, holding her sleeping children, terrified by the pilot's warning that if they hit a headwind, they would go down in the sea. Imagine the psychological terror of those hours. Every pocket of turbulence felt like the end. Every drop in engine pitch sounded like failure. She wasn't just afraid of dying. She was afraid of what would happen if they were forced to land in Greece. The colonels would not execute them, but they would imprison them. The image of her children growing up in a junta prison cell must have flashed through her mind. In the darkness of the cabin, time seemed to dissolve. Fear no longer came in waves. It became constant. The fairy tale narrative had promised her a golden carriage. Instead, she was in a metal tube, freezing cold, praying to a god who seemed to have abandoned the house of Glucksburg. The radio was silent. The junta had jammed the frequencies. They were flying blind, ghosting through the night sky, terrified of being intercepted by their own air force. The king, usually so confident, sat in stunned silence. He had gambled his crown and lost. Now he was gambling his family's lives. As they crossed the Adriatic, the fuel gauge dipped into the red. The pilot announced they were approaching Rome, but the weather was atrocious. Heavy rain, low visibility. They had one shot at landing. When the wheels finally touched the wet tarmac of Ciampino Military Airport at 4 a.m., there was no applause. There was only the collective exhale of people who had cheated death. They taxied to a remote corner of the airfield. The engines cut out, and in the sudden ringing silence, the reality hit Anne-Marie. She was homeless. The reception in Rome was a study in humiliation. The Italian government was embarrassed. They didn't want to offend the colonels in Athens with whom they had diplomatic relations. They didn't want a deposed king on their soil. They treated the royal family not as heads of state, but as unexpected, inconvenient refugees. They were taken to the Greek embassy in Rome. It was the middle of the night. The embassy staff, unsure of where their loyalties lay, to the king or the junta, were cold and distant. This period exposes the full psychological cost of exile. Anne-Marie, the sister of the Queen of Denmark, had to rely on the charity of the Danish ambassador just to feed her children. The next day, she was photographed by the paparazzi shopping for basic clothes in Rome. The press had a field day. The king in exile. The queen in a skirt she bought yesterday. The contrast was brutal. 3 years ago, she had 60 bridesmaids and a dress made of lace and dreams. Now she was a refugee in a raincoat haggling for baby formula. But the physical humiliation was nothing compared to the emotional blow that was coming. The human body keeps the score. The stress of the past 2 months, the conspiracy, the terror of the coup, the flight in the storm, the shock of exile was too much for Anne-Marie to bear. In January 1968, just weeks after arriving in Rome, Anne-Marie suffered a miscarriage. She lost the child she had carried through the revolution. This is the emotional nadir of the nightmare. It is the moment where the political tragedy becomes a visceral physical loss. That baby was a victim of the coup as surely as any political prisoner. Historians often gloss over this event, focusing on Constantine's political maneuvering. But for Anne-Marie, this was the breaking point. She was in a foreign country, living in a borrowed house. Her husband was depressed and stripped of his power. Her mother-in-law was pacing the halls like a caged tiger, and now her womb was empty. The fairy tale had promised happily ever after. Instead, it delivered death. The psychological impact was devastating. She fell into a deep depression. She felt she had failed in her primary duty as a queen to provide heirs, and failed as a mother to protect her unborn child. And yet, because she was royalty, she was not allowed to grieve publicly. She had to put on a brave face. She had to stand by her husband as he gave press conferences, pretending that they would return to Greece soon. But deep down, Anne-Marie knew. She knew the dream was dead. The Greece she loved, the Greece of the islands and the light, was gone. All that was left was the gray rain of Rome and the ghost of a child she would never hold. For the next 5 years, the family lived in a strange limbo in Rome. They were officially still the king and queen of Greece. The junta had not yet abolished the monarchy. They kept Constantine as a figurehead, appointing a regent in Athens. They even sent him a small allowance. But it was a charade. The king and queen were essentially living on the charity of wealthy royal relatives. King Frederick IX of Denmark, Anne-Marie's father, and the Shah of Iran sent money. Anne-Marie, who had grown up in palaces with armies of servants, had to learn how to run a household. She learned to cook. She learned to drive a car in traffic. She learned to manage a budget. This period was the re-education of Anne-Marie. She stripped away the trappings of royalty and found the woman underneath. She became the rock of the family. Constantine was often manic, plotting returns, meeting with spies, falling into despair when plans failed. Anne-Marie was the steady hand. She created a little Greece inside their rented villa. She insisted the children speak Greek. She celebrated Greek Easter, but the nightmare mother-in-law was still there. Queen Frederica lived near them in Rome and later moved to India and Spain. She continued to interfere, blaming everyone but herself for the disaster. Anne-Marie had to navigate the exile of her husband while managing the bitterness of her mother-in-law. The fatal weakness of the couple during this time was hope. They truly believed the exile was temporary. They kept their bags packed. They refused to buy furniture because we will be home by Christmas. This false hope was a torture. It prevented them from moving on. It kept them trapped in 1967, while the world moved forward into the 1970s. In 1973, the junta decided they didn't need the fiction of the monarchy anymore. Following a failed Navy mutiny, which the king supported from afar, the dictators formally deposed Constantine. They stopped the allowance. They confiscated the Tatoy Palace. They seized the royal estates. Overnight, the king in exile became just Constantine Glucksberg. But the real blow came in 1974, when the junta fell and democracy was restored. Constantine Karamanlis, the man Frederica had destroyed, returned to power. He called for a referendum on the monarchy. The king and queen were not allowed to return to Greece to campaign. They had to make their case via television from London, where they had moved. Anne-Marie sat beside her husband as he apologized to the Greek people. "I made mistakes," he said. "I was young." But the Greek people were not in a forgiving mood. On December 8, 1974, the results came in. 69.2% voted for a republic. It was a landslide rejection. This was the moment the tragedy came full circle. It wasn't just the colonels who rejected them, it was the people. The very people who had cheered for Anne-Marie's wedding 10 years earlier now voted to banish her forever. The rejection was personal. Posters in Athens showed Anne-Marie with the caption, "The Dane, the foreigner, the thief." They accused her of stealing the crown jewels, which was false. She had left most of them behind. They accused her of being a spendthrift. They projected all their anger at the junta onto the royal family. Anne-Marie took the news with stoic Danish dignity. She didn't rage. She didn't give angry interviews. She simply accepted that her life as a queen was over. She was 28 years old. She was a retired monarch, a mother of 3, soon to be 4 and 5, and a woman without a country. The years following the referendum were the long winter. The Greek government, now a socialist republic, became vindictive. They stripped the royal family of their Greek citizenship. This created a legal nightmare. Anne-Marie had renounced her Danish citizenship to become Greek. Now she was not Greek. She was legally stateless. She traveled on a Danish diplomatic passport issued by her sister, Queen Margrethe II. But the name on the passport was a problem. The Greek government forbade her from using the title Queen of the Hellenes. They demanded she use the surname Glucksberg. Constantine refused. "I was born a king. I will die a king," he said. "I do not have a surname." So Anne-Marie existed in a legal gray zone. She was a ghost queen. She could travel anywhere in the world, except to the one place she called home. She was banned from entering Greece. Imagine the pain of that ban. She had children born in exile. Nikolaos in 1969, Theodora in 1983, Philippos in 1986. She raised them on stories of Greece. She showed them pictures of Tatoy. She taught them Greek dances. But she couldn't show them the Parthenon. She couldn't take them to the islands. Greece became a mythical land to her children, a Narnia they could never visit. And for Anne Marie, the fairy tale had curdled into a permanent state of longing. She was the Rose of Denmark who had been transplanted to Greek soil, only to be uprooted and thrown onto the pavement. She never replanted herself. She refused to become British. She refused to become Danish again. She remained stubbornly, quietly, painfully Greek. Her tragedy was silence. While her husband gave interviews and plotted returns, Anne Marie kept her mouth shut. She knew that any word she said could be twisted by the Greek press. So she became the silent queen, the woman who bore the burden of history without complaint. But silence has a cost. It eats you from the inside. And as the years turned into decades, the vibrant, laughing girl of 1964 disappeared, replaced by a woman of immense dignity, but immense sadness. By the mid-1970s, the fairy tale had settled into a stagnant, melancholy reality. The royal family had moved to London, settling in the affluent quiet of Hampstead Garden suburb. To the outside world, it looked like a life of enviable privilege. They were invited to tea with Queen Elizabeth II, who was Constantine's second cousin. They attended charity balls in Mayfair. They skied in St. Moritz with the glitterati of Europe. But if you scratch the surface of this golden life, you would find the nightmare of irrelevance. Anne Marie was raising 5 children in a house that was essentially a waiting room. The suitcases were never truly unpacked, metaphorically speaking. Constantine lived in a state of perpetual readiness, keeping a bag by the door, convinced that the Greek people would wake up from their Republican fever dream and call him back. Anne Marie knew better. She possessed the quiet, pragmatic intuition of the Danes. She read the newspapers. She saw the hatred in the Greek press where she was caricatured daily, but she played the role of the supportive wife perfectly. She created a bubble of Greekness in London. She founded the Hellenic College of London so her children, and the children of other Greek exiles, could be educated in their language, their history, and their Orthodox faith. This period revealed the fatal weakness of their exile, the refusal to assimilate. Most refugees, whether they are princes or paupers, eventually accept their new reality. They build new lives in their new lands. Anne Marie and Constantine refused to do so. They lived with one foot in London and one foot in a Greece that no longer existed. This psychological split was exhausting. Anne Marie had to be the emotional anchor for a husband who was often depressed, manic, or obsessed with political conspiracies. She was the glue holding a shattered dynasty together. She was the Queen of Hampstead, reigning over a kingdom of school runs, grocery shopping, and memories. The Rose of Denmark had become an English housewife, but her heart remained a hostage in Athens. In February 1981, the nightmare mother-in-law, Queen Frederica, died in Madrid during eyelid surgery. Her death sparked a diplomatic crisis that would traumatize Anne Marie all over again, reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. The family wanted to bury Frederica at Tatoi, the royal cemetery outside Athens, next to her husband, King Paul. The Greek government, terrified that a royal funeral would spark pro-monarchy riots, initially refused. Negotiations dragged on for days, turning a moment of grief into a political bargaining session. Finally, the government granted permission, but the permission came with conditions so humiliating they underscored the family's status as pariahs. They were allowed to land in Greece, go directly to the cemetery, bury the body, and leave immediately. They were granted a mere 6 hours on Greek soil. There would be no overnight stay, no visit to their former home, no moment of reflection. On February 12, 1981, Anne-Marie stepped onto Greek soil for the first time since the night of the coup in 1967. She was 34 years old. She had left as a terrified girl of 21. She returned as a mother of 5. The scene at the funeral was surreal. The government had locked down the area with thousands of riot police surrounding the cemetery. Anne-Marie stood by the grave, shivering in the cold wind. She wasn't just burying her difficult mother-in-law, she was burying the era of the Iron Queen. But she didn't have time to grieve. As soon as the earth was thrown onto the coffin, the police ushered them back to the cars. They were told their time was up. They were driven back to the airport like criminals being deported. For Anne-Marie, this was a moment of profound psychological violence. To be told you cannot mourn in your own home, to be treated as a contagion that must be removed before nightfall, reinforced the refugee nightmare. She realized then that the hatred for the monarchy had not faded with time. It had calcified into state policy. For the next decade, the family stayed away. But in 1993, sensing a thaw, or perhaps misreading the room again, Constantine decided to take his family on a private holiday to Greece. They chartered a yacht, planning to sail around the islands, visit a few monasteries, and show their children the country they had only seen in books. It was supposed to be a quiet trip. It turned into a political circus. The Greek government, now led by the conservative Constantine Mitsotakis, who was under immense pressure from the socialist opposition, panicked. They viewed the king's presence not as a holiday, but as a provocation. Everywhere the yacht went, crowds gathered. People cheered. They brought flowers. They kissed Anne-Marie's hand. The fairy tale magic flickered back to life for a brief moment. The people, tired of corrupt politicians, looked at the aging royal couple with nostalgia. This terrified the political establishment in Athens. The government ordered the Greek navy to shadow the yacht. Military planes flew low overhead, buzzing the vessel in a clear act of intimidation. Finally, the government issued an order declaring that the royal family was disturbing the peace and must leave Greek waters immediately. Anne-Marie stood on the deck of the yacht as they were escorted out of the country by warships. She was weeping. This incident is crucial because it destroyed the fragile truce between the exiles and the Republic. It proved to the politicians that the king still had the power of popularity. And in politics, if you can't control a rival, you destroy him. The socialist leader Andreas Papandreou used this holiday as a weapon. He campaigned on a platform of punishing the king, promising to finish with the Glücksburgs once and for all. When Papandreou won the election later that year, he prepared the ultimate punishment. In 1994, the Greek parliament passed Law 2215. It was a legislative guillotine designed to sever the last link between the country and the dynasty. The law was ruthless in its efficiency. It confiscated all royal property: Tatoi Palace, Mont Repos, where Alexia was born, and the Polydendry estate, without compensation. These were private properties, bought with private money, not state assets. More devastatingly, it stripped the royal family of their Greek citizenship. The law declared that they could only regain citizenship if they swore an oath to the Republic and adopted a surname. The government suggested Glücksburg, a name intended to mock their foreign origins. For Anne-Marie, this was a catastrophe of identity. She had renounced her Danish citizenship in 1964 to become Greek. Now, Greece said she was not Greek. She was stateless. Legally, she did not exist. Imagine the state of her psyche at this moment. She was 48 years old. She had given her youth, her innocence, and her womb to Greece. She had endured coups, exile, and miscarriage, and now the country was telling her she was nothing. She was a ghost. The name issue was particularly insulting. Constantine refused to accept the name Glücksburg, stating he was born a king and would die a king. Anne-Marie was forced to ask her sister Queen Margrethe of Denmark for a favor. Margrethe issued them Danish diplomatic passports. But what name to put on them? The passports listed them as H.M. King Constantine and H.M. Queen Anne-Marie. In the eyes of international law, this was a courtesy title. In the eyes of the Greek customs officers, it was a joke. Anne-Marie became a prisoner of bureaucracy. She couldn't travel to certain countries without a visa. She had to explain her status at every border crossing. Her nationality was Danish, but her name was Queen of Greece. It was a paradox that confused immigration officers around the world. She had become the Queen of Nowhere. Stripped of their rights, the family did the only thing left. They sued. They took the Greek government to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. They argued that the confiscation of their private property without compensation was a violation of human rights. The Greek public was outraged. The press painted them as greedy, money-hungry aristocrats trying to loot the treasury. Anne-Marie bore the brunt of this hatred silently. She knew the truth. It wasn't about the money. It was about the principle. It was about Tatoi, the home where she had lived as a young bride, the place where her children's nursery still stood, frozen in time since the night the tanks came in 1967. The legal battle dragged on for years. It was ugly. The Greek government lawyers called them usurpers and tyrants in open court. Finally, in November 2000, the court ruled. The verdict was bittersweet. The court ruled in favor of the royal family, stating the confiscation was illegal. However, the court did not order the return of the property. Instead, they ordered the Greek government to pay compensation. The amount was set at 12 million euros, a fraction of the estimated 500 million euro value of the estates. It was a moral victory, but a financial insult. Anne-Marie's reaction was telling. She didn't celebrate. She didn't want the money. She wanted her home. She wanted the graves of her ancestors. In a final gesture of dignity and a final rebuke to her critics, Anne-Marie and Constantine announced that they would not keep a single cent of the compensation. They used the money to create the Anna Maria Foundation, a charity dedicated to helping victims of natural disasters in Greece. Think about the irony. The country that stripped her of her citizenship, called her a thief, and banned her from entry, was now receiving millions of euros from her in charity. This was the Fairytale bride, showing her steel. She proved that you can take a queen's crown, her passport, and her house, but you cannot take her class. However, the money didn't buy them entry. They were still banned. They were still exiles. The nightmare had shifted from a political thriller to a legal tragedy. Anne-Marie was now a wealthy philanthropist who couldn't visit the people she was helping. By the turn of the millennium, Anne-Marie had been in exile for 33 years. Most of her life had been spent waiting for the coup to end, waiting for the referendum, waiting for the lawsuit, waiting for a visa. She had become invisible to the younger generation of Greeks. To them, Anne-Marie was a trivia question, a name from history books associated with the dark days of the junta. They didn't know her, and she didn't know them. She spoke a Greek that was frozen in the 1960s, formal, royal, archaic. She didn't know the slang of modern Athens. She didn't know the new neighborhoods. She was a foreigner in her own soul. The fairy tale was a distant memory. The refugee nightmare had become her normal. She was the matriarch of a displaced tribe, a woman who had learned that the only land she truly owned was the plot of Earth, where she stood at any given moment. But the wheel of history was turning one last time. Greece was preparing to host the 2004 Olympics. The world was coming to Athens, and the International Olympic Committee had a member named Constantine of Greece. The government realized they couldn't ban an IOC member from the Olympics without causing an international incident. The door was about to crack open, just a little bit. And Anne-Marie was preparing to step through it, terrified that it might slam shut on her fingers again. In the summer of 2004, the world returned to Athens for the Olympic Games. It was a moment of supreme national pride for Greece, a showcase of a modern, confident democracy that had long since moved past the shadows of the junta and the civil war. And quietly, almost unnoticed amidst the fireworks and the pageantry, the exiles slipped back in. The Greek government found itself in a diplomatic bind. King Constantine was a long-standing member of the International Olympic Committee and an honorary member of the International Sailing Federation. To ban him from the Games would have caused a scandal with the IOC. So grudgingly, the gates were unlocked. For Anne-Marie, this return was fundamentally different from the frantic 6-hour funeral visit of 1981. This was not a visit of grief, it was a visit of validation. She sat in the Olympic Stadium watching the Greek flag rise, surrounded by the very politicians who had spent decades demonizing her family. But the fairy tale did not resume. There were no crowds cheering "Long live the Queen." There was only a polite, somewhat awkward indifference. The Greek public was too distracted by the festivities to care about the elderly couple sitting in the VIP section. This indifference was, in a strange way, a blessing. It signaled the end of the hatred. For 30 years, Anne-Marie had been a symbol of political toxicity. Now she was simply a curiosity. The venom had drained out of the wound. She walked through the streets of Athens and nobody shouted at her. Nobody chased her. She was no longer the nightmare mother-in-law's puppet. She was just a Danish woman enjoying the games. However, the refugee nightmare was not entirely over. They were still staying in a hotel. They were tourists in their own kingdom. Every night, Anne-Marie looked out at the lights of the city she used to rule, knowing that when the closing ceremony ended, she would have to pack her bags and return to the gray skies of London. The door was open, but they were not yet allowed to stay. History is full of ironies. The event that finally allowed the royal family to return permanently was the collapse of the Greek economy. In 2009, Greece plunged into a devastating financial crisis. The country was on the brink of bankruptcy. Anger boiled over in the streets. But this time, the rage was not directed at the Glucksbergs. It was directed at the politicians, the very socialists and conservatives who had spent 40 years blaming the monarchy for Greece's problems. Suddenly, the narrative shifted. The politicians who had demonized the king were now the villains. The monarchy, by comparison, looked like a harmless relic of a more stable time. Sensing this shift, Constantine and Anne-Marie began to visit more frequently. They sold their mansion in Hampstead Garden suburb for a reported £9.8 million. It was a decisive move. They were burning their bridges in London. They were coming home. In 2013, 46 years after they fled in the dead of night, Anne-Marie and Constantine moved back to Greece permanently. They did not move to Athens. The capital was still too politically charged. Instead, they settled in Porto Heli, a wealthy enclave on the Peloponnese coast. They bought a beautiful but relatively modest villa. There were no fanfares, no official announcements, no restoration of titles. They returned as private citizens. For Anne-Marie, this was the quiet victory she had waited a lifetime for. She could finally unpack her suitcases. She could finally plant a garden, knowing she would be there to see the flowers bloom. The refugee nightmare of statelessness and homelessness was officially over. She was home, but the home she found was not the one she left. She was now a stranger in her own land. She had to learn how to be a Greek housewife. She was photographed pushing a shopping cart in a local supermarket. The woman who once wore the emerald parure tiara was now buying feta cheese and olive oil like any other grandmother. This normalcy was the ultimate antidote to the nightmare. The fairy tale had promised her a throne, but reality gave her something better: peace. The final act of the tragedy played out in January 2023. King Constantine II died at the age of 82 after years of declining health. His death reopened the old wounds one last time. The Greek government debated how to handle the funeral. Should it be a state funeral? Absolutely not, said the Prime Minister. Constantine was a private citizen, but the royal families of Europe disagreed. Kings and queens from Spain, Denmark, Sweden, the Netherlands, and Britain descended on Athens. The sheer volume of blue blood forced the government's hand. They allowed a private funeral that looked suspiciously like a state event. Anne-Marie, now 76 years old, stood at the center of it all. She walked into the same cathedral where she had been married as an 18-year-old bride. The symmetry was heartbreaking. In 1964, she had walked down that aisle in a storm of white lace, full of hope. Now she walked back up it in black velvet, surrounded by the ghosts of her life. She placed a wreath of lilies of the valley on the coffin, the same flowers she had carried in her wedding bouquet. The card on the wreath was handwritten, "Your beloved Anna Maria." This gesture revealed the core of her character. After 59 years of marriage through coup, exile, miscarriage, depression, and poverty, she still loved him. The fairy tale had turned into a nightmare, yes, but the love story had survived the wreckage. The crowds outside the cathedral shouted, "Long live the king," as the coffin passed. It was a final, belated vindication. But Anne-Marie did not wave. She simply bowed her head. She knew that the cheers were for the dead, not the living. They buried him at Tatoi, in the royal cemetery that had been overgrown with weeds for so long. The family had cleaned it up. Constantine was laid to rest next to his parents, Paul and Frederica. The circle was closed. When we look back at the life of Queen Anne-Marie, we see a woman who was crushed by the machinery of history. She was the collateral damage of a war between the left and the right, between the palace and the parliament. She entered the stage as a prop, a beautiful silent doll intended to secure the dynasty. The establishment used her youth to sell a fairy tale, and then the same politicians used her foreignness to scapegoat her for the dictatorship. She lost everything that defines a person's identity: her home, her nationality, her passport, her reputation, and her unborn child. She spent the prime of her life living in borrowed houses, waiting for a phone call that never came. And yet, she is the winner. She outlived the dictators. She outlived the politicians who stripped her of her citizenship. She outlived the hatred. Anne-Marie transformed from the Rose of Denmark, fragile, decorative, easily bruised, into the olive tree of Greece. She became something hardy, something that can survive drought and rocky soil, something that endures. Her legacy is not in the laws she signed or the palaces she built, for she did neither. Her legacy is in her dignity. In a world where exiled royals often become bitter, loud, or scandalous, Anne-Marie maintained a stoic, elegant silence. She refused to badmouth the country that rejected her. She refused to play the victim. The fairy tale that turned into a refugee nightmare teaches us a brutal lesson about the 20th century. It teaches us that no amount of gold or privilege can protect you when the tide of history turns. It teaches us that a passport is more valuable than a tiara. But it also teaches us about the resilience of the human spirit. Anne-Marie walked through the fire of the Greek catastrophe and emerged on the other side, not as a queen, but as a woman who knows exactly who she is. She is the last queen of Greece. And as she sits in her garden in Portoheli watching the sun set over the water she was once forbidden to cross, she knows that while she lost the throne, she kept her soul. The nightmare is over. The silence is finally peaceful. Is